close your eyes. I'm about to turn the light on and I don't want to blind you. Sorry about that. I need a little bit extra light for me to read to you tonight. As you can hear, it's a bit rainy and stormy outside, so I thought I'd read you something to go to bed. Now, the story I wanted to read actually hasn't come in yet, but we'll save that for another night. Okay, let's move that light. I don't want to blind you. So the only thing I had in my collection was the Underbury Witches. It's from Nocturnes, I'm actually not sure, and it's by John Connolly. I'm actually not sure if it deals with witches in the sense that we're usually dealing with, but I thought I'd give it a shot. It is rather long, so if you fall asleep while listening, my feelings will not be hurt. Okay. Alright, so let's go ahead and begin. This is called the Underbury Witches. Steam and fog swirled together under the station platform, turning men and women to grey phantoms and creating traps for the unwary out of carelessly positioned cases and chests. The night was growing colder, and a faint sheen of frost could already be detected upon the roof of the ticket office. Through the steamed-up glass of the waiting room, figures could faintly be discerned, huddling close to the noisy radiators that reeked of oil and smouldering dust. Some drank tea from cheap cups lined with spidery cracks, sipping urgently as though apprehensive that the crockery might yet disintegrate in their hands and shower them with tepid liquid. Tired children cried in the arms of weary parents. A retired major tried to engage 2 soldiers in conversation, but the men, new conscripts already fearful of the trenches, were in no mood to talk. The station master's whistle sounded defiantly in the gloom, his lamp swinging gently above his head, and the train slowly began to move away, leaving only 2 other men standing upon the suddenly deserted platform. Had there been anyone to see or to care, it would have become quickly apparent that the new arrivals did not belong in Underbury. They carried heavy bags and were dressed in city clothes. One, the larger and elder of the 2, wore a bowler hat and a muffler around his mouth and chin. His brown coat was slightly frayed at the sleeves, and his shoes were built for comfort and long life, with few nods to fashion or aesthetics. His companion was almost as tall as he, but slighter and better dressed. His coat was short and black, and he wore no hat, exposing a mass of dark hair that was a good deal longer than would ordinarily have been considered acceptable in his chosen profession. His eyes were very blue, and he might almost have been called handsome were it not for a curious aspect to his mouth, which curled down slightly at the edges and gave him an air of perpetual disapproval. "No welcoming committee then, sir," said the older man. His name was Arthur Stokes, and he was proud to call himself a sergeant of detectives in what he did not doubt was the greatest police force in the world. "The locals never like it when they're forced to accept help from London," said the other policeman. His name was Burke, and he enjoyed the rank of inspector in Scotland Yard, if enjoyed was indeed the right word. Judging by his expression at the moment in question, endured might have been a more appropriate term. "The arrival of 2 of us is unlikely to make them doubly grateful." They made their way through the station and onto the road beyond, where a man stood waiting beside a battered black car. "You'll be the gentleman from London," he said. "We are," said Burke. "And you would be?" "My name's Croft. The constable sent me to collect you. He's busy at the moment. Local newspapermen. We've had some of the London boys calling on us as well." Burke looked puzzled. He was told not to make any comment until we arrived, he said. Croft reached out to take their bags. "And how's he supposed to do that, then, if he can't talk to them first to tell them that he can't make no comment?" he asked. He winked at Burke. Sergeant Stokes had never seen anyone wink at the inspector before, and he wasn't convinced that Croft was the ideal candidate to be the first. "Fair point, I suppose, sir," said Sergeant Stokes hurriedly, then added for form's sake, "Don't you think?" Bert gave his sergeant a look that suggested he thought a great many things, of which few were complimentary toward the present company. "Whose side are you on, Sergeant?" "The side of law and order, sir," Burke replied happily. "The side of law and order." The witch panic that gripped Europe for over 300 years, beginning in the mid-1400s and ending with the death in Switzerland in 1782 of Anna Goldie, the last woman in Western Europe to be executed for witchcraft, claimed the lives of between 50 and 100,000 people, of whom 80% were women, most of them old and most of them poor. Such panics were most prevalent in the German lands, which accounted for roughly half of all of those killed. Fewer than 500 died in England, but twice that amount were executed in Scotland, due in no small part to the Scottish court's greater tolerance for torture as a means of securing confessions, and the paranoia of its young monarch, James VI. The most comprehensive guide to the identification, interrogation, and finally immolation of witches was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, co-authored by the German Dominican Heinrich Kramer and Father James Springer, the Dean of Theology at the University of Cologne. Kramer and Springer pinpointed the seed of witchcraft in the very nature of the female species. Woman was spiritually, intellectually, and emotionally weak, and motivated primarily by carnal lust. These fundamental flaws found their most potent expression in witchery. The coming of the Reformation did little to undo such beliefs. If anything, any existing tolerance for the so-called wise woman of village life was to be stamped out along with any other evidence of old pagan ways, leading Martin Luther himself to declare that they should all be burned as witches. It would be 1736 before the crime of witchcraft would officially be removed from the books of law in England, almost 120 years after the capture, trial, and execution of 3 women known as the Underbury Witches. Croft drove the 2 policemen to the heart of the village of Underbury, where they checked into a pair of small but warm rooms at the back of the Vintage Inn. When they had refreshed themselves and taken some tea, the 2 policemen were brought to the local undertakers. Waiting for them were the village doctor, Henson, and the sole representative of the local constabulary, Constable Waters. Henson was young and a recent arrival in Underbury with his family following the death of his uncle, who had previously dealt with the births, illnesses, and various manifestations of mortality in the area. Henson walked with a slight limp, a vestige of childhood polio, which had excused him from service in France. Waters, in Burke's view, was a typical village copper, cautious without being careful, and with a modest intelligence that had not yet evolved to the stage of wisdom. All 4 men stood by while the undertaker, a man seemingly composed entirely of creases and wrinkles, slowly uncovered the body that lay upon his slab. "We haven't done much with him yet, on account of you gentlemen coming down from London," he explained. "Lucky it's been cold, or else he'd be on the turn more than he is already." The body revealed to them was that of a man in his early 40s, with the bulk of one who laboured in the fields during the day, at the dinner table in the evening, and in the pub at night. His features, or what remained of them, were discoloured, and the men could smell the greater decay already taking place inside him. There were long vertical wounds across his face, and similar injuries to his chest and stomach. The wounds were deep and penetrated far into his body, so that his innards were clearly visible to them. Rolls of torn intestine extruded from 2 of his cuts, like the larvae of some dreadful parasite. "His name was Malcolm Travers," said Waters. "Mal to most people. Single man, no family." "Good Lord," said Stokes. "It looks as though an animal attacked him." Burke nodded to the undertaker and said he would be called if he was needed. The little man exited quietly. And if he felt any sense of injury at his exclusion, he was far too practiced in his trade to show it. Once the door to the embalming room was closed, Burke turned to the doctor. "You've examined him?" Henson shook his head. "Not fully. I didn't want to interfere with your investigations. I've taken a closer look at these wounds, though, and if it's the work of an animal, it's like none I've ever seen." "We've sent out word to the circuses and fairs in the area," said Constable Waters. We'll soon find out if they've lost one of their beasts." Burke nodded, but it was clear that he had little interest in what Waters had just said. His attention remained on Allinson. "Why do you say that?" The doctor leaned over the body of the dead man and pointed to smaller abrasions to the left and right of the main cuts. "You see these? In the absence of any other evidence, I would say that they were left by thumbs with deep nails on the ends of them." He raised his hand, curled his fingers slightly as though grasping a ball, then raked them slowly through the air. "The deep wounds come from fingers, the ancillary angled cuts from the thumb," he continued. "Couldn't someone have used some kind of farm implement on him?" said Stokes. "The sergeant was London through and through, and his knowledge of agriculture extended no further than washing the dirt from vegetables before cooking them. Nevertheless, he had a pretty fair suspicion that if one were to open up any barn between here and Scotland, there would be enough sharp objects contained within to fillet a whole tribe of men such as Trevor's." "It's possible," said Allinson. "I'm no expert on farm tools. We may know a little more once I've taken a closer look at the body. With your permission, Inspector, I'd like to open him up. A more detailed examination of the wound should confirm it." But Burke was once again leaning over the body, this time looking at his hands. "Can you pass me a thin blade?" he asked. Allinson took a scalpel from the instrument bag, then handed it to the policeman. Burke carefully placed the blade beneath the nail of the dead man's right index finger and probed. "Get me something to hold a sample." Allinson gave him a small dish, and Burke scraped the residue from beneath the nail into it. He repeated the process with each nail in the right hand until a small scattering of matter lay on the dish. "What is it?" asked Constable Waters. "Tissue," answered Allinson. "Skin, not fur. Very little blood. Hardly any, in fact." "He fought back," said Burke. "Whoever attacked him should be marked." "He'll be long gone then," said Waters. "A man scarred in that way won't hang around to be found out." "No, perhaps not," said Burke. "Still, it's something. Can you take us to where the body was found?" "Now," said Waters. "No, the morning should do. In this fog, we'll risk trampling on any evidence that hasn't been crushed or lost already. Doctor, when do you think you might complete your examination?" Allinson removed his jacket and began to roll up his sleeves. "I'll start straight away if you like. I shall know more by morning." Burke looked to his sergeant. "Right then," he said. "We'll be off for now, and we'll see you at 9 tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen." And with that, the strangers left. The village of Underbury numbered barely 500 souls, half of whom lived on small farms some distance from the village itself, with its church, its inn, and its handful of stores all set near the crossroads that marked Underbury's heart. A visitor might have noted that the central area in which the two roads met was considerably larger than one might have expected. It was perhaps 60 feet across, and was dominated by a raised grass circle upon which no flowers grew. Instead, to alleviate its dullness, a statue had been raised to the Duke of Wellington, although the cheap stone used for its creation had already begun to disintegrate, giving the Duke the physical appearance of one who was slowly succumbing to leprosy, or one of the more unmentionable social diseases. To understand the nature of the circle at the crossroads required a knowledge of local history of which few visitors could boast. Underbury, once upon a time, was a far more populous place than it is now appeared to be, and was, in fact, the commercial hub for this part of the county. A vestige of those former days still remained in the form of weekly farmers' markets held each Saturday in a field on the east side of the village, although in the past, and indeed in the present, in places other than Underbury, such markets traditionally took place in the very heart of the village. This practice came to an end in the latter half of the 17th century, when Underbury became the focus of the largest single investigation into witchcraft ever undertaken in the British Isles up to that point. The reasons for the arrival of the witch-finders remain unclear, though an outbreak of illness among some of the children in the village may have provided the initial spur. 5 children died in the space of a single week, all of them firstborn males, and suspicion fell upon a trio of women newly arrived in Underbury from parts unknown. The women claimed to be sisters of independent means, formerly resident in Cheapside. The eldest, Ellen Drury, was a midwife, and took over such duties in the village following the sudden drowning of her predecessor, one Grace Pollery. Ellen Drury delivered the male children, who subsequently passed away, and it was immediately said of her that she had cursed them as they passed from womb to world. Demands for the woman's arrest and questioning grew louder, yet the Drury sisters had managed, in their brief time in Underbury, to make themselves popular with many of the local women, due to their facility with various medicines and herbs. It may also have been that the Drury sisters could have been described almost as proto-feminists, for they encouraged those who were victims of casual abuse from their husbands and male relatives to make a stand against such acts, and a number of men found their houses surrounded by groups of shouting women, invariably led by Ellen Drury and one or both of her sisters. In fact, one resident, a farmer named Brodie, and a vicious man towards his wife and daughters to boot, was so badly beaten as he made his way home through the fields one night that it was thought he would not survive his injuries. Brodie subsequently declined to name his assailants, but gossip in the village intimated that the Drury sisters were abroad that night, and that their walking staffs were ingrained with Brodie's blood. While few wept for the victim of the assault, who was left with a useless right hand and an impediment to his speech as a result of the attack, this was clearly a state of affairs that could not be allowed to continue. The deaths of these children gave the men of the village the excuse that they sought, and a pair of witch-finders was dispatched from London on the orders of the king to investigate the occurrences. There is little that needs to be said about the manner of the witch-finders' inquiries, for their methods have been recorded elsewhere. Suffice it to say that the Drury sisters were sorely tried, along with 10 other women from the village, of whom 2 were married, 3 were very ancient, and 1 barely 12 years of age. Marks were found upon their bodies, patterns of warts, unexplained folds of skin in their private parts, that were construed as evidence of the woman's diabolical nature. The young girl, under threat of torture, admitted to the practice of witchcraft and claimed that she had seen Ellen Drury prepare the potion that took the lives of the newborn infants. She told her interrogators that the 3 women were not in fact sisters at all, although she did not know their true names. Finally, she added stories of debauches conducted in the woman's cottage in which she was forced to participate, and of treason spoken against the Church of England, and even against the king himself. A confession thus secured, the women were presented to the circuit court judges, and sentence was passed. On 18th November 1628, Ellen Drury and her sisters were hanged to death in the village square at Underbury, and their remains buried in an unmarked plot to the north of the cemetery, just beyond its walls. Their co-defendants were set to suffer the same fate, but the intervention of the king's physician, Sir William Harvey, who was curious about the nature of the witch marks allegedly found upon the bodies of the convicted women, led to their transportation to London, where they were re-examined by the Privy Council, and among whose members their fate was subsequently debated at leisure. 5 of the prisoners passed away while imprisoned, and 10 years went by before the survivors were quietly released to spend their final years in poverty and ignominy. Ellen Drury was the last to die on the gallows. Even in her final agonies, it was said of her that her eyes remained fixed on her tormentors, unblinking, until a relative of the unfortunate Brodie threw pitch upon her and set her alight, whereupon her eyes exploded in their sockets and her world went dark. Dr. Allinson worked into the early hours, examining the wounds left upon the body of Maltravers. The largest of them, as he later told Birkenstocks over breakfast at the inn, extended internally from the man's belly all the way to his heart, which had been pierced in 5 places by long claws or nails. At this point, Sergeant Stokes briefly lost his appetite for bacon. "Are you telling us that a hand was pushed up through this man's body?" asked Burke. "It would appear so," replied the doctor. "I inspected him closely in the hopes that I might find a fragment of nail, but none was forthcoming, which I find surprising under the circumstances. It is no easy thing to tear apart a man's insides in such a way, and some shattering would have been expected. It leads me to suspect that either the nails of the hand were unusually strong, or that the fingers have been artificially enhanced in some way, perhaps by the addition of metal talons that could be strapped on or removed as needed." The doctor could add nothing more to the sum of their knowledge, and retired to his bed at the behest of his wife, who had arrived to do a little shopping and encourage her exhausted husband to return home. She was a woman of striking looks, a tall blonde with flawed green eyes that caught the light as though they were emeralds inset with fragments of diamond. Her name was Emily, and Burke exchanged only a few words with her as he escorted her husband to the door. "Thank you for your help," he said, as Allinson buttoned his coat at the door of the inn, his wife remaining inside to exchange some pleasantries with the innkeeper's daughter. "I'm sorry that I could not be of more assistance," said Allinson. "Nevertheless, it is most intriguing in a dreadful way, and I should like to take one more look at Travers later, before we leave him to the gentle ministrations of the undertaker. It may be that, in my exhaustion, I miss some detail that could prove useful." Ooh, this story just keeps going. It just keeps going. Alright, we're in it for the long haul. Burke assented, then stepped aside in order to allow Miss Allinson to pass. And a most curious thing happened. Directly across from Burke was a mirror, advertising some brand of whiskey, which the policeman was unfamiliar. He could see himself reflected clearly in its surface, and, as she passed, so too was Emily Allinson, but through some distortion in the glass it appeared as though her reflection moved more slowly than she did, and Burke almost believed that it seemed to turn its face toward him, even though the original stared fixedly ahead. That face, for an instant, was not that of Emily Allinson. Elongated and ruined, its mouth gaped, and its face was grotesquely charred in places, the eyes like cinders in their sockets. Then Miss Allinson stepped outside with her husband, and the vision was gone. Burke walked closer to the mirror and saw that it was deeply tarnished, as such cheap advertising tools tend to become. Its surface was mottled and uneven, so that even his own face shimmered and buckled like an image in a carnival tent. Yet he remained unsettled, even as he watched Miss Allinson escort her husband down the street, the doctor seeming almost to lean into her for support as they went. There were few males under the age of 50 wandering through Underbury that morning, although this was by no means unusual. Most towns and villages were now sorely depleted of their stock of young men, and Burke had no doubt that when the present hostilities came to an end, it would still be many more years before places like Underbury found some balance restored between the sexes. Burke returned to his sergeant, but he allowed the remainder of his breakfast to go cold and untouched. "Anything wrong, sir?" asked Stokes, who had rapidly regained his appetite with the departure of the doctor. "Just tiredness," replied Burke. Stokes nodded and finished off the runny yolk with a swipe of his toast. It was a good breakfast, he thought. Maybe not as good as the breakfast Miss Stokes cooked up for him, but very satisfying nonetheless. His good lady wife often offered the view that Inspector Burke could do with a little fattening up, but Burke was not one to accept invitations to dinner. In any event, Stokes understood that by fattening up his wife meant that Burke should be married, with a good strong table beneath, which he could rest his feet while a woman fed him cooked meals, but Inspector Burke appeared to have little time for women. He lived alone with his books and his cat, and while he was always courteous in his dealings with ladies, even with those for whom the term ladies usually came with the appendage of the night, he remained distant and even slightly uncomfortable in female company. Such an existence would have proved insufferably lonely for Stokes, who fitted easily into the company of both sexes, but police work had made him conscious of the differences between people and the complexity that lay beneath even the most apparently mundane of lives. Besides, he felt a great admiration and even a fondness for the inspector, who was a very good copper indeed. Stokes was proud to serve alongside him, and his private life was a matter for himself and no one else. Burke stirred and removed his coat from a hook on the wall. "I think we need a little air," he said. "It's time to see where Mal Travers died." Burke and Stokes stood at one side of the post, Constable Waters at the other. It was still possible to discern traces of the victim's blood upon the wood, and fragments of his jacket sleeve were caught in the barriers of the wire that formed a fence marking the verge of the property on which they stood. Beyond lay barren ground, then the low wall surrounding the church and the village cemetery. "He was found against the post, his sleeves hanging from the wire," said Waters. "Poor beggar," he added. "Who found him?" asked Stokes. "Fred Paxton. He remembered Travers leaving the pub shortly before 10, and he followed about an hour later." "Did he touch the body?" "No call to. Didn't need letters after his name to tell that he was dead." "We'll have to talk to Paxton." Waters proudly drew himself up a little. "Thought you might say that. He and his missus live not half a mile up the road, and I told them to expect us this morning." Burke would happily have flayed Waters with the fence wire had he not taken this simple step, but the detective allowed the village policeman a muted, "Well done, constable," which seemed to content Waters. "Did you search the area?" Burke resumed. "I did." Burke waited. Travers was crossing the field when he was attacked, and it was a cold night. The temperature had not risen much since. In fact, if anything, it had fallen. Burke could see footsteps and those of his companions receding toward the road. Whoever attacked Travers must have left some sign upon the grass. Well, there were only 2 sets of footprints, Mal Trevor's and Fred Paxton's. I tried to keep people away from the body once I'd seen what had been done to it, so there wasn't as much disturbance as you might think. Perhaps he was attacked on the road, said Stokes, then attempted to escape across the fields and died on the fence when he could go no further. Don't think so, said Waters. There was no blood in the field between the road and the fence, I checked. Burke knelt and examined the ground at the base of the post. There was still a great deal of dry blood visible upon the blades of grass. If what Waters said was true, and even Burke was forced grudgingly to acknowledge a certain level of competence on the part of the village copper, then Travers had been attacked on this spot and had died here. Something must have been missed, he said at last. No disrespect to you, Constable, but whoever killed Travers didn't materialize out of thin air. We'll go over the ground on either side of the fence, each inch by inch. There has to be some trail. Waters nodded his assent, and the 3 men spread out from the death post. Burke moving toward the cemetery, Stokes toward the road, and Waters in the direction of a cottage some way distant, which was, he informed the detectives, the home of the Paxtons. The policemen searched for an hour until the cold had burrowed into their hands and feet, yet found nothing. It seemed that Mal Travers had been attacked quite literally from out of nowhere. Burke finished his examination of the ground and sat upon the low cemetery wall, watching his fellow policemen as they moved across the field. Stokes bent over slightly, his hands in his pockets, Waters less careful, but still doing his best. In his heart, Burke knew that it was a futile yet necessary effort. To have made a proper search would have required more men, and men were scarce, but even then he remained unconvinced that anything would be found. Still, it made no sense to him that a big man like Travers could be savagely murdered with no sign of struggle. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped it over his face. He was sweating profusely and starting to feel a little ill. It's this place, he thought. It saps one's energy. He recalled Dr. Allinson walking down the main street, virtually propped against his wife, in the earlier lassitude of Constable Waters, which seemed to have been arrested somewhat by the arrival of new blood in the form of the 2 London policemen. Underbury was a village emptied of its most virile men, all of whom were now fighting in foreign fields. Those that remained must have been aware of their status as flawed bodies, unsuited for combat or sacrifice, and that awareness hung like a miasma over their lives. Now Burke was feeling it too. If he stayed here too long, perhaps he also would end up like Allinson, exhausted after a few hours' labour, for the doctor told him that he had retired to bed shortly after 1 in the morning. He had therefore rested for some 6 hours, but at breakfast Burke would have sworn that the man had not enjoyed proper sleep in many months. Burke slipped down from his porch and went to rejoin his colleagues. As he did so, his foot struck stone. He stepped back, then knelt down and brushed the tips of his fingers along the ground. There was a slab there, almost entirely covered by long grass and weeds. The vegetation came away easily as Burke pulled at it, for some of it had merely fallen across the stone, or had been placed there to conceal it. There was no inscription upon it, but Burke knew its purpose. This was an old community, and he did not doubt that in times past the bodies of suicides, of unbaptized children, and of gallows fodder had been interred outside the walls of the cemetery. It was common practice, although it was rare to see a mark of any kind upon such graves. Now, as he looked at the ground from this low angle, he could see 2 other similar raised slabs nearby. When he examined them, he discovered that the stone on one had been broken recently. Someone had taken a hammer and chisel to it, fragmenting the rock into a number of pieces, and leaving a hole as big as Burke's fist at the center. Burke leaned forward and slipped 2 fingers into the gap, expecting to touch earth below. Instead, there was only emptiness. He tried a similar experiment using his pin tied to a piece of thread from his coat, and again felt the instrument dangle in the space beneath the stone. Curious, he thought. He stood and saw Stokes and Waters watching him from the road. There was nothing more to be learned by the cemetery wall, so he joined them and made no argument when Waters suggested that now might be the time to talk to the Paxtons, and perhaps take some tea for their trouble. What kind of man was Travers? Burke asked Waters as they made their way along the road. The constable made a noise somewhere between a cough and a sigh. I didn't care for him much myself, he said. He served time in a prison up north for assault, then came back down here when he was released, and lived with his father until the old man died. After that, it was just him alone on that farm. And the mother? Died when Mal was a boy. Her husband used to bear her. Her husband used to beat her, and she never made a complaint. Constable Stewart, my predecessor, he tried talking to her and to her husband, but nothing ever came of it. I reckon Mal picked up some of his old man's habits because he was jailed for beating up well, you'll forgive me, sir, but a prostitute in Manchester. Near killed her, from what I hear. When he came back here, he took up with a woman named Elise Warden, but she soon gave him a wide berth when he fell back into his old ways with her. There was an incident about a week ago when he came to her house in the night and demanded to speak to her, but her father and younger brother sent him on his way. They'd already given him a taste of his own medicine once, but he didn't fancy another spoonful. Burke and Stokes exchanged a look. Could the Wardens be suspects? They were all in the bar when Travers left, and they were still there when Fred Paxton came back there with news of what he'd found. They never left. Even Elise was with them. They're in the clear as far as this is concerned. Waters reached into his pocket, withdrew a folded sheet of paper, and handed it to Burke. Thought you might want this. It's a list of all the people who were in the bar that night. A star marks the ones who were there from the time Travers left until the time the Paxtons arrived. Until the time the Paxtons returned. Burke took the list and read it. One name caught his eye. Miss Allinson was there that night, and her husband. Saturday night's the big night in the village. Most people find their way to the end, sooner or later. Emily Allinson's name was one of those marked with a star, and she never left, he said, so quietly that nobody heard him utter the words. Alright. That's where we're going to stop for tonight. Okay. I'm going to turn out the light. Okay. Sweet dreams, and we will resume the story next time.